Today, I'd like to present a model that my colleagues and I have been working on that tries to help organizational leaders to remove bias in the hiring and promoting of minorities and thereby reach their diversity goals. Um, I want to talk a little bit about how we came to build this model and how we built the model in a technique called system dynamics. And then I'll describe the model in some detail and how it works. And then I want to show you how we've implemented it in a graphical user interface on the internet for anyone to use and experiment with. Then I want to talk about next steps if you're interested in applying this model to your organization. As background, I want to just mention that this work came from a presentation I saw by two women, and they presented a system dynamics model about bias against women in academia in the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics fields. And I saw this presentation and was very impressed. And I said to myself, could this model be generalized for any underrepresented group and any organization? So I generalized the model, and then my colleagues and I built a graphical user interface and implemented it on the web and has made it available for anyone to use to apply the model to their organization. And then I presented this graphical user interface to the Structural Racism Special Interest Group of the System Dynamics Society, and a number of interesting applications started from that presentation. Now, system dynamics is based on cause and effect relationships and not statistics. So it's important to recognize this because uh, if you're going to try to change the system, you want to know how the cause and effect relationships work. So you want to affect something by changing what causes it. So it's not statistics. So cause and effect is not correlation. It's actually based on the physical nature of how the model works, how the system works. Also, system dynamics recognizes that real systems have inertia. So a big part of the issue is that change takes time. So I often talk about, pushing an iceberg where you have this huge iceberg, which is the system, and it takes a lot of effort to move that iceberg in the right direction, and the movement can be quite slow, and so it takes a lot of time to get the system or the iceberg in the place that you wanted. And the goal of system dynamics is to examine the impact of policy changes. So, by knowing the causes and the effects, we can develop policies that will change the system, then make and get it to move in the right direction so that we'll get a better future for the system. Now, there's two types of biases that we looked at in this model. We looked at implicit systemic bias against minorities in the hiring and promoting processes. This could be, for example, in the questions that are asked at the interviews or the questions used in the examinations, or it could be very much implicit in the members of the board, the structure and the members of the board who are doing the hiring and promoting. So these could be very hidden to the organization and need to be examined carefully. The second type of bias that we looked at was self-bias, where a minority individual might be biased against pursuing advancement. And this would be an idea where a member of the minority might not apply for a job or apply for a promotion because they don't think they will win the job or promotion, and or they don't think they will be welcomed in the organization if they get the job, or welcomed into the management team if they get the promotion. So they won't apply for this advancement. And if they don't apply, they can't be hired. So this is a very important type of bias in the system. Now, let's look at the way the cause and effect relationships work in the model. The system begins with open positions to fill. And the more open positions to fill, the more possibility of hiring a minority person to fill the position. So this is a cause and effect relationship shown by the arrow in this direction. And we also label it with an S, which means that these two things move in the same direction. So the more open positions, the more hiring of a minority person. And the less open positions, the less hiring of a minority person. So this means that it's moving in the same direction. And this will be important when we look at the structure and the behavior that is created by that structure in the system. So once there's an open position, there's a possibility of hiring a minority person, who will join the staff from in the organization and will be a member of the organization, and that will lead back to the open positions. However, because you've increased the staff, you now have less open positions to fill. So now we have an idea that this connection is a cause and effect relationship that moves in the opposite direction. More staff leads to less positions. So we label that with an O. So now we can look at the behavior that is generated by this type of a structure. So more open positions leads to more hiring, leads to more staff, leads to less open positions. So this is heading towards a situation where all of the positions are filled and we stop hiring, and the staff stabilizes. So this is what we call in system dynamics a balancing loop, labeled with a B. What we also call it a goal-seeking loop. So the idea is the goal is to fill all the positions in the organization, and the process carries through to reach that objective. And this is just one type of behavior that we look at in system dynamics. And so it's important to see that the structure of the system leads to the behavior that is resulting. Now, the next thing we looked at was the probability of hiring and the probability of applying. So we have two probabilities. We have the probability of hiring a minority applicant if they apply, and then we have the probability of a minority applicant actually applying. So these are probabilities that affect the hiring of a minority person, and they move in the same direction. So the higher the probability of hiring a minority applicant, the more likely you'll hire a minority applicant. And the higher the probability of an applicant applying, the more likely you'll hire a minority applicant. And these two things go together in this hiring decision. So the next thing we looked at was implicit systemic bias against the minority in the hiring process. So this systemic bias impacts the probability of hiring a minority applicant who applies. And the higher the systemic bias, the lower the probability. So these things move in the opposite direction. The lower the systemic bias, the higher the probability. So we can see that this is a relationship that results in a certain behavior. Now, if you can trace through the system, and we can see that, for example, higher systemic bias would lead to lower probability of hiring, which will lead to fewer people hired, which would lead to lower staff in the organization, which would lead back, we believe, to more implicit systemic bias. So we have a cycle now, a situation where um, this can get worse and worse. So more systemic bias leads to higher probability, leads to less hiring, leads to fewer staff, leads to more systemic bias, leads to lower probability, lower hiring, even lower staff, even higher systemic bias. So this is a situation that could occur. However, there's another possibility. There's the possibility of lower systemic bias leading to higher probability, leading to more hiring, leading to more staff, leading to further less systemic bias. So this is what we call a reinforcing loop, or we label it with an R. And this reinforcing loop could be vicious in the sense that the number of staff goes down and down and down, or it could be virtuous. The number of staff could go up and up. So we don't know ahead of time whether this loop or this system is vicious or virtuous. And that's why it's important to build a quantitative model and put numbers to these values to see what the which direction the system would move. So the last thing we included was a reinforcing loop on on self-bias. So here we have increasing staff from the minority leads to less self-bias. It's moving in the opposite direction, which leads to a higher fraction of applicants from the minority based on the potential minority applicants, which leads to a higher probability of applying, which leads to more hiring of minority people, which leads to a higher staff, which leads to further lower self-bias, to leads to higher fractions of people applying. And so we have this idea of a potential virtuous cycle here, or we have the opposite. We could have a vicious cycle where lower staff leads to more self-bias, leads to a smaller fraction, leads to a smaller probability, leads to less hiring, leads to less staff. So again, we have a reinforcing loop and we don't know ahead of time which direction this loop will lead us. So we build a quantitative model to do this. And one of the aspects of a quantitative model in system dynamics is this idea of pipes, a flow between populations in this case. So here we have a pipe or a flow of minority workers being hired, and they become part of the minority workers population. And the hiring is based on, as I described, the probability of hiring a minority worker and the number of open positions that are available. And then the person joins the population of minority workers, and they could leave either by retiring or leaving the organization, or they could leave the worker population by being promoted to a manager. And the promotion process is based on the probability of promoting a minority worker to a management position and the idea that there has to be a management position open to promote into. And then the idea is that the minority managers would eventually retire, opening up more positions, and therefore, there would be more promoting. So at this point, I want to show you the quantitative model that we implemented and posted on the web. So here is the website that you go to if you click the link, which I'll show you later, and you start the process of analyzing your organization. And this leads to an introduction of the model, and you can read that and understand better how the model works. And then you start this process with these steps starting from the top, and you begin by describing your community. And what you're doing there is you're identifying the initial population in the community and the percent of that population from the minority. So the idea here is that we want to have an organization that's representative of the community. So in this case, 25% of the population is from minority groups. And so we would like to have 25% of the organization at all levels to be from the minority group. And that is the goal. That's the representativeness goal. So The next thing we do is we look at the qualifications and interest levels in the population. So the people who we're going to hire have to be qualified. And there's a certain number, a certain percent of the population in the community that are qualified for an entry-level job in the organization. However, those people have to be interested enough to join the organization. So we also have to quantify the percent of the qualified people who are interested in joining the organization. And with those two numbers, we get an idea of the maximum possible applicants. The next thing we do is we describe the company, and we identify the total number of managers and workers and the total number of managers and worker from the minority. And this is a very simple dichotomy where we have only two types of employee. We have managers and workers, and we have two types of people, populations, a minority population and a majority population. So it's a very simple statement of the issue. However, it could be generalized to have more populations of minority groups that you want to represent. You could also have more levels in the organization where you have more types of workers, more types of organized sub-organizations. You could have more levels of supervision, more levels of management. You could have an executive group. And you want to, in the long run, have the whole organization at all levels and across the organizations, sub-organizations, to be representative of the community that you're working in. The next thing you have to define is the career lengths of the workers and the managers. That's important to know to see how the turnover is in the company. And then you also define the time it takes to hire and promote workers. And then the other thing you can do is you can identify whether the company is expanding, staying the same, or downsizing. And so these are possible changes in the organization over time. Then we get into the bias in hiring and promoting. So we've set this up now to start with a neutral situation, which is no bias in the system, no systemic bias and no self-bias. So if we run the model at this point, we get this result based on the numbers we put into the model. And we can see that we have a situation where the organization starts off at a low level of representativeness. And over time, the diversity of the organization improves, and the organization becomes more and more representative of the community, which is a good thing. And basically, it says that the system will naturally get more diverse. The organization will naturally get more diverse if through the regular retirement processes, if the hiring process is unbiased, which I think is a very positive result. However, notice the time length here. This is a 20-year time period, and it decreases quite slowly. It increases quite slowly. So the question you might ask is can we speed up this process? You know, can we wait 20 years to see this improvement, or would we like to see this improvement occur much greater speed? So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to look at a couple of different options and scenarios and see how that affects this diversity growth. First thing we're going to consider is the idea of systemic bias against the minority group in the hiring process. And if we run that case, we see this result where the diversity is stagnant over time, and basically you have no improvement in the diversity, maybe even some decline in diversity over the 20-year period because of systemic bias against the minority. Now we have a look at the systemic bias towards the minority. And if we run this case, we see that now we increase the diversity quite a lot over time. This is maybe a more desirable situation. And this is compared to the no bias situation. So now we'll look at self-bias. So in self-bias, let's begin by looking at self-bias that encourages minority applicants to apply. And that is a positive self-bias. And this leads to a situation where the diversity level increases over the no bias situation, but not as much as the systemic bias situation. So that's an interesting result. And then the next thing we'll look at is self-bias of the minority against the minority. And we'll see if we run that we end up with a situation where the diversity level is much lower over time than the no bias situation. However, it is increasing slowly, and it's not as bad a situation as systemic bias against the minority. So this is 5 different scenarios of worker population. And we can also look at the management population. And we can see here that the management diversity would grow over time in most of the scenarios. However, there would be a delay. And so it would take time for the hired minority people to move through the system to get to a point where they could apply for a management position. And as they move through the system and more minority people are hired, then over time we will have more minority people in the management team. That is, if we have no systemic, no bias in the promoting process. Now, this shows all of the parameters of the model on one page. And so a leader of an organization could set up the model to represent their organization, represent the community, and represent their organization, and then run the model for a number of scenarios based on changing the parameters to see whether they can reach their diversity goals in the time that they desire. And if they can find the parameters where they would reach their goals, then they could develop policies that might get to those parameters over time and therefore reach their goals. And so I think this could be a very useful tool for someone who's trying to reach diversity goals in a certain amount of time. So now in terms of in terms of issues and approaches, basically, as we've seen, we have this idea of systemic bias in the hiring of a minority applicant, and we have this idea of the fraction of applicants from the minority, and then we can either attack the implicit bias in the system by looking at the hiring process in detail and seeing if there's some kind of way we can change this process to be more non-biased. Or we could also approach the problem of increasing the fraction of applicants from the minority by increasing the potential minority applicants, such as some kind of a hiring process with on-the-job training that might allow more people to be qualified for a job in the organization. And possibly another way we could improve the fraction of applicants from the minority is by reducing the self-bias in the minority applicants. So next steps, if you're interested in applying this model to your organization, is we would sit down with you and talk to you about your goals and objectives. And this would involve your hopes and your fears and the way you see the organization developing over time. And then we would adapt this model to to your situation and look for data to from your organization where the model could be applied and calibrated to reproduce the situations that have occurred in the past. And by thereby we validate that the model is a good representation of your system. And then with this model calibrated, we can look at potential futures where we look at possible ways to change the system to reach your goals. And so then we would look at action plans that could affect change in the parameters and thereby develop develop your system in a way that reaches your goals. And these action plans are generally some kind of a policy and an implementation of that policy. So here are some references. This is the original paper from the conference that I saw on women in STEM. This is a paper that a colleague and I wrote on the bias model, the more general bias model that we developed. And then this is a link to the website where you can run the model yourself. So if you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me um, and we can discuss how to apply this in your organization. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention.